Most people think empaths are weak. They see kindness and mistake it for vulnerability. They see patience and assume there are no limits. But what they don't realize is that an empath is often the strongest person in the room, someone who has endured more pain than they ever talk about. And when you push an empath too far, when you exploit their loyalty, betray their trust, and mistake their silence for surrender, something changes. They stop explaining. They stop chasing. They stop caring. And that's the moment most people realize they made a mistake they can never undo. Don't break an empath, because what comes next isn't revenge. It's a version of them you'll never get access to again. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is believing that empaths are weak. The moment someone sees a person who is compassionate, understanding, patient, and emotionally aware, they often assume that person lacks strength. Society has conditioned many people to associate strength with dominance, aggression, loudness, and control. Because of this, individuals who naturally care about others are frequently underestimated. Yet the truth is exactly the opposite. Empaths are not weak because they feel deeply. They are strong because they continue functioning while carrying emotional weights that many people never even notice. An empath experiences emotions with a level of intensity that can be difficult for others to understand. They don't simply hear someone's story, they absorb the emotional atmosphere surrounding it. When a friend is hurting, they feel the heaviness. When someone is anxious, they sense the tension. When there is conflict in a room, they often pick up on it before anyone says a word. This heightened awareness is not a weakness. It requires tremendous emotional resilience to navigate a world where the feelings of others constantly pass through your awareness. Many people think emotional sensitivity means fragility. They assume that if someone is affected by the emotions of others, that person must be easily broken. What they fail to see is the daily endurance that empathy requires. Imagine carrying not only your own struggles, but also being deeply aware of the struggles of those around you. Imagine noticing sadness hidden behind smiles, hearing pain hidden behind jokes, and sensing loneliness behind confident appearances. An empath often lives with this reality every day, yet they continue showing up for people, offering support, encouragement, and understanding. There is a difference between feeling emotions and being controlled by them. Empaths often develop remarkable emotional intelligence because they spend so much time observing human behavior. They learn to recognize fear, insecurity, disappointment, and frustration. They become skilled at reading situations and understanding perspectives that others overlook. While some people react impulsively to emotional situations, empaths frequently pause, analyze, and consider the feelings of everyone involved. This level of awareness requires discipline and maturity. The world tends to celebrate physical toughness while overlooking emotional toughness. Physical strength is visible. Emotional strength is often invisible. A person lifting heavy weights receives admiration. A person carrying emotional burdens with grace often receives little recognition. Yet emotional endurance can be just as demanding. An empath may face disappointment, betrayal, criticism, and rejection while still choosing compassion. They may be hurt by someone's actions and still seek to understand the reasons behind those actions. They may experience emotional pain and still remain kind. Empaths often become the people others turn to during difficult times. Friends seek their advice. Family members confide in them. Coworkers trust them with personal concerns. Strangers sometimes feel comfortable opening up to them within minutes of meeting them. This happens because empaths create a sense of safety. Their ability to listen without judgment allows others to express thoughts and feelings they might never share elsewhere. This role can be rewarding, but it also demands significant emotional energy. Because empaths are naturally understanding, people sometimes assume they can handle unlimited pressure. They become the emotional support system for everyone around them. Others bring their problems, frustrations, fears, and worries, often without realizing how much energy is being consumed. An empath may spend hours helping someone process a challenge while quietly dealing with their own struggles in the background. Their willingness to help can create the illusion that they are unaffected by stress, when in reality they are carrying far more than most people realize. Another reason empaths are misunderstood is that they often choose peace over conflict. To some observers, avoiding unnecessary arguments appears weak. In reality, many empaths understand conflict better than most. They can see how destructive ego-driven battles become. They recognize when an argument is fueled by insecurity rather than truth. Choosing not to engage in every conflict is not surrender. It is often a conscious decision based on wisdom and self-control. Empaths also possess a unique form of courage. It takes courage to remain compassionate in a world that can sometimes be harsh. It takes courage to stay open-hearted after disappointment. It takes courage to trust again after betrayal. Many people respond to pain by building walls around themselves. Empaths often continue believing in the value of connection despite the risks involved. They understand that caring deeply can lead to heartbreak, yet they continue caring anyway. Their strength is found in their ability to remain human when circumstances encourage them to become cold. While others may become cynical after negative experiences, empaths frequently fight to preserve their compassion. They understand pain firsthand, which is why they are often determined not to become a source of pain for others. This decision requires constant effort, self-awareness, and emotional discipline. Every act of kindness offered after being hurt represents a form of strength that cannot be measured by appearances. An empath's depth of feeling allows them to build meaningful relationships, understand complex emotions, and connect with people on a profound level. What some perceive as sensitivity is actually awareness. What some interpret as softness is often resilience. What appears to be vulnerability is frequently the result of a person who is brave enough to remain emotionally present in a world where many choose emotional distance. Kindness is one of the most misunderstood qualities a person can possess. Many people see someone who is generous, patient, forgiving, and understanding, and they immediately make assumptions about what that means. They assume that kindness equals weakness. They assume that a kind person will tolerate anything. They assume that because someone chooses compassion over confrontation, there are no boundaries, no limits, and no consequences for crossing lines. These assumptions create one of the most common mistakes people make when dealing with an empath, mistaking kindness for unlimited tolerance. An empath often gives people chances that others would never give. They believe in growth. They believe people can learn from mistakes. They believe everyone carries unseen struggles that influence their behavior. Because of this mindset, they frequently approach others with patience instead of judgment. When someone disappoints them, they try to understand the circumstances. When someone makes a mistake, they look for explanations before jumping to conclusions. When someone behaves poorly, they often consider the emotional pain or insecurity that may be driving that behavior. This willingness to understand others is admirable, but it can also create a dangerous illusion. Some people begin to believe that the empath's patience has no limits. They mistake understanding for acceptance. They mistake forgiveness for permission. They mistake compassion for weakness. As a result, they become comfortable repeating behaviors that should have been corrected long ago. What they fail to recognize is that kindness does not erase boundaries. An empath can be patient while still having standards. They can be understanding while still expecting respect. They can forgive while still remembering what happened. They can offer grace while still recognizing harmful patterns. The fact that they do not react immediately does not mean they are unaware of what is happening. Empaths are often highly observant individuals. Because they pay close attention to emotions, behaviors, and patterns, they notice far more than people realize. They notice inconsistencies between words and actions. They notice changes in tone, attitude, and effort. They notice when someone only reaches out when they need something. They notice when respect becomes one-sided. They notice when loyalty is no longer being reciprocated. Their silence is often mistaken for ignorance, when it is actually awareness combined with restraint. Restraint requires strength. Anyone can react impulsively. Anyone can express anger in the heat of the moment. Anyone can create conflict the second they feel disappointed. An empath often chooses a different path. They observe. They reflect. They evaluate. They try to determine whether a problem is temporary or part of a larger pattern. They give people opportunities to correct themselves without public confrontation. This process can take weeks, months, or even years. Because of this patience, some individuals become increasingly careless. They begin pushing boundaries further and further. Small acts of disrespect become larger acts of disrespect. Broken promises become regular occurrences. Selfish behavior becomes normalized. The empath continues offering understanding, and the other person starts believing there will never be consequences. They assume the relationship will always remain intact regardless of their behavior. The reality is that every empath has a limit. That limit may be difficult to see because it is rarely announced. Empaths do not always issue dramatic warnings. They do not always threaten to leave. They do not always engage in loud confrontations. Instead, they quietly collect information through observation. Every broken promise adds to the picture. Every betrayal adds another piece. Every act of disrespect contributes to a growing understanding of who someone truly is. One reason people underestimate these limits is because empaths are often more focused on preserving relationships than winning arguments. They value connection. They value trust. They value harmony. Because these things matter to them, they work hard to maintain them. They communicate. They compromise. They adjust. They forgive. Yet these efforts should never be confused with endless tolerance. Tolerance has a boundary where self-respect begins. An empath may endure difficult situations for longer than most people would, but eventually they reach a point where continuing to tolerate harmful behavior would require abandoning their own values. At that moment, the dynamic changes. The person who once invested tremendous energy into understanding others begins directing that awareness toward protecting themselves. Many people are shocked when this happens because they assumed the empath would always remain available. They assumed the kindness would continue no matter what. They assumed that because previous mistakes were forgiven, future mistakes would be forgiven as well. They fail to realize that forgiveness and tolerance are not the same thing. Forgiveness is a personal choice to release resentment. Tolerance is a decision to continue allowing certain behaviors into your life. An empath may forgive countless times while gradually losing trust. They may continue offering compassion while becoming increasingly aware of unhealthy patterns. They may maintain kindness while internally recognizing that change is unlikely. Their calm demeanor often hides a deep process of evaluation that others never see. The greatest misunderstanding occurs when people believe that kindness removes consequences. In reality, kindness often delays consequences because an empath gives opportunities for growth and correction. Those opportunities are gifts, not guarantees. Every chance represents a choice to believe someone can do better. Every moment of patience represents hope that respect, honesty, and effort will eventually be returned. When those opportunities are repeatedly ignored, the empath's kindness remains intact, but their willingness to tolerate harmful behavior begins to disappear. One of the most damaging things a person can do is take an empath for granted. Unlike obvious acts of betrayal or conflict, taking someone for granted often happens gradually. It develops through small behaviors, repeated over time until they become normal. A person starts assuming the empath will always be there. They begin expecting support without appreciation, loyalty without reciprocity, and understanding without effort. What begins as comfort slowly transforms into entitlement, and many people never realize the damage they are creating until it is too late. Empaths naturally give a great deal of themselves to the people they care about. They listen when others need someone to talk to. They offer encouragement during difficult times. They remember important details, notice emotional shifts, and provide support even when they receive little recognition for doing so. Their attention to the needs of others often becomes such a consistent part of a relationship that people stop noticing it altogether. Human beings have a tendency to adapt to what is consistently available. When something valuable is always present, its value can become invisible. The same thing happens in relationships. The friend who always answers the phone, the partner who always understands, the family member who always helps, and the person who always forgives can eventually become viewed as permanent fixtures, rather than individuals making conscious choices every day. Their efforts are no longer appreciated because they are expected. An empath often becomes the emotional foundation of relationships. They are the person who checks in when others are struggling. They are the person who remembers birthdays, celebrates achievements, and notices when someone seems different. They invest emotional energy into maintaining connections. Because these actions are performed quietly and consistently, people rarely stop to consider how much effort is involved. The hidden cost begins when the empath's contributions are no longer acknowledged. Appreciation is one of the most important elements in any healthy relationship. It communicates that someone's efforts are seen, valued, and respected. When appreciation disappears, the imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The empath may continue giving, but internally they begin noticing the lack of reciprocity. Taking an empath for granted often reveals itself through subtle patterns. Someone only contacts them when they need advice. Someone expects immediate support but becomes unavailable when support is needed in return. Someone receives understanding for their mistakes while offering little understanding for anyone else's. Over time, the relationship becomes centered around one person's needs, while the empath's needs remain largely unnoticed. Because empaths are naturally compassionate, they frequently excuse these patterns at first. They tell themselves the other person is stressed. They assume circumstances are temporary. They focus on maintaining harmony rather than addressing every disappointment. Their ability to understand different perspectives allows them to justify behavior that others might reject immediately. This understanding can unintentionally enable unhealthy dynamics. The more patient the empath becomes, the more comfortable some people become with giving less and taking more. They start assuming that support will always be available regardless of how they behave. The relationship shifts from mutual care to one-sided dependence. One reason this dynamic is so dangerous is that empaths rarely make dramatic announcements about their dissatisfaction. They do not always demand recognition. They do not constantly remind people of everything they have done. They are often motivated by genuine care rather than a desire for praise. Because they remain quiet, others assume everything is fine. What many people fail to recognize is that an empath's silence does not mean they are unaffected. They notice every imbalance. They notice every time their effort goes unreturned. They notice every broken promise, every dismissive response, and every instance where their kindness is treated as an obligation rather than a gift. These observations accumulate over time. The emotional exhaustion created by this process can be significant. Supporting others requires energy. Being available requires energy. Offering compassion requires energy. When these efforts are not reciprocated, the empath begins operating from an increasingly depleted emotional reserve. They may still appear calm and supportive on the outside, while quietly becoming overwhelmed on the inside. Another hidden cost is the gradual erosion of trust. Trust is not only about honesty. It is also about believing that a relationship is balanced and mutually respectful. When an empath repeatedly invests in someone who shows little appreciation or effort, they begin questioning whether the relationship truly values them. They start recognizing the difference between being loved and being relied upon. Many people confuse dependence with connection. They assume that because an empath remains present, the relationship is healthy. They fail to ask whether the empath feels supported, respected, or understood. They become so accustomed to receiving that they stop considering what they are giving. The irony is that the qualities people take for granted are often the very qualities they struggle to find elsewhere. Genuine empathy is rare. Authentic understanding is rare. Consistent emotional support is rare. Someone who genuinely listens, cares, and invests in others without selfish motives is not easily replaced. Yet because these qualities are freely given, they are often undervalued until they disappear. An empath's loyalty can create a false sense of permanence. People assume that because the empath has stayed through previous disappointments, they will stay through future ones as well. They mistake consistency for inevitability. They forget that every act of loyalty is a choice, not a guarantee. As the imbalance continues, the empath becomes increasingly aware of a difficult truth. They begin recognizing that some people appreciate what they provide more than they appreciate who they are. They realize that certain relationships depend heavily on their effort to survive. They notice that if they stopped initiating conversations, offering support, or maintaining the connection, the relationship might quickly fade. These realizations can be painful because empaths invest deeply in the people they care about. They value genuine connection and often assume others value it equally. Discovering that a relationship has become one-sided forces them to confront a reality they may have avoided for a long time. The emotional weight of feeling unseen, unappreciated, and emotionally exhausted begins creating distance between what they give and what they are willing to continue giving. Every empath has a limit. The challenge is that most people never see it coming because empaths rarely advertise where that limit exists. They are known for their patience, understanding, and willingness to give people multiple chances. Because they often tolerate more than most individuals would, others begin to believe they can tolerate anything. This assumption becomes one of the greatest mistakes people make. The moment an empath reaches their limit is rarely sudden for them, but it often feels sudden to everyone else. Before an empath reaches that point, there is usually a long period of observation. While others may think everything is normal, the empath is paying attention. They notice patterns. They notice repeated disrespect, broken promises, selfish behavior, manipulation, and emotional inconsistency. They notice when apologies are repeated, but behavior never changes. They notice when their kindness is treated as an obligation instead of a gift. They notice when they are expected to understand everyone else's struggles while nobody takes time to understand theirs. Because empaths naturally look for the good in people, they often spend a significant amount of time hoping things will improve. They give opportunities for growth. They allow room for mistakes. They believe people can learn and change. This optimism keeps them invested long after many others would have walked away. Yet each disappointment leaves a mark. Every ignored boundary, every act of dishonesty, and every moment of disrespect becomes part of a larger picture they are quietly building. What makes this process unique is that empaths usually do not react strongly to individual incidents. Instead of exploding over one mistake, they absorb and analyze. They ask themselves questions. Was this intentional? Is this temporary? Does this person understand the impact of their actions? Can this situation be repaired? Their desire to be fair often causes them to give people the benefit of the doubt again and again. Over time, however, something begins to change. The empath starts seeing patterns instead of isolated incidents. What once looked like occasional mistakes begins to look like consistent behavior. They realize that understanding someone's reasons does not erase the consequences of their actions. They recognize that compassion cannot fix a problem that another person refuses to acknowledge. This realization creates an internal shift. The empath begins withdrawing emotional energy. At first, the change may be subtle. They stop explaining themselves as much. They stop trying to solve every problem. They stop initiating difficult conversations that always seem to lead nowhere. The emotional investment that once flowed naturally becomes more guarded. People often misinterpret this stage. Because the empath remains polite, calm, and respectful, others assume everything is fine. They fail to recognize that the relationship is already changing. What they are witnessing is not forgiveness. It is evaluation. The empath is deciding whether continued investment is worth the emotional cost. As disappointment accumulates, emotional exhaustion starts replacing hope. The empath realizes they cannot carry an entire relationship by themselves. They cannot force honesty, respect, loyalty, or effort from someone who consistently chooses otherwise. The responsibility for maintaining the connection can no longer rest entirely on their shoulders. When an empath finally reaches their limit, the change is often dramatic precisely because it follows such a long period of patience. The person who once fought to preserve the relationship suddenly stops fighting. The person who once offered endless understanding stops searching for explanations. The person who once gave countless chances stops creating new ones. This moment surprises many people because they only see the final decision. They do not see the months or years of reflection that came before it. They do not see the countless disappointments, the ignored boundaries, the repeated attempts to communicate, or the emotional energy that was invested trying to make things work. To outsiders, it may appear impulsive. To the empath, it is often the conclusion of a very long process. One of the most significant changes is emotional detachment. The empath who once cared deeply begins protecting themselves by creating distance. Their attention shifts away from fixing the relationship and toward restoring their own peace. The emotional access that others once enjoyed becomes restricted. Conversations become shorter. Effort becomes limited. Availability decreases. The reason this shift feels so powerful is because empaths rarely reach it without serious cause. Their nature encourages connection, understanding, and reconciliation. For someone with those qualities to stop investing emotionally, a threshold has usually been crossed many times over. What appears to others as a sudden transformation is often the result of accumulated experiences finally outweighing hope, trust, and patience. One of the most misunderstood moments in any relationship involving an empath is the moment they stop caring. People often expect anger. They expect arguments, dramatic confrontations, emotional outbursts, or attempts at revenge. What they rarely expect is silence. Yet silence is often the clearest sign that something significant has changed. For an empath, the silent exit is not usually a sudden reaction. It is the final stage of a long emotional journey that has already taken place internally. When an empath cares about someone, they invest deeply. They think about the person's feelings, needs, struggles, and well-being. They make efforts that often go unnoticed. They worry about problems that are not even their own. They spend time trying to understand perspectives, repair misunderstandings, and strengthen connections. Their emotional involvement is genuine and substantial. Because of this deep investment, people often assume that an empath will always remain emotionally attached. They become accustomed to the attention, support, patience, and understanding. No matter how many disappointments occur, they believe the empath will continue showing up. They mistake commitment for permanence. What they fail to recognize is that caring requires energy. Every conversation, every attempt to resolve conflict, every effort to maintain trust requires emotional resources. An empath can give generously, but they cannot give endlessly without receiving something meaningful in return. When the relationship becomes consistently one-sided, the emotional cost begins to outweigh the emotional reward. The process rarely begins with detachment. It begins with effort. The empath tries to communicate concerns. They try to explain how certain behaviors affect them. They attempt to create understanding and encourage change. Their goal is usually preservation rather than separation. They want the relationship to improve, not end. When those efforts are ignored, dismissed, or repeatedly met with the same harmful behavior, frustration begins to replace optimism. The empath starts noticing that they are having the same conversations over and over again. The same promises are made, the same mistakes are repeated, the same patterns continue. At this stage, many people still assume everything is recoverable because the empath remains present. What they do not realize is that physical presence and emotional investment are not the same thing. The empath may still be there, but the emotional connection is already weakening. As time passes, the empath gradually stops investing energy where it is not valued. They stop chasing explanations. They stop initiating every conversation. They stop trying to convince someone to care. They stop carrying responsibilities that were never theirs to begin with. The effort that once flowed naturally begins disappearing. This change is often so subtle that it goes unnoticed at first. The other person becomes accustomed to receiving attention and support, so they fail to recognize its absence until it becomes impossible to ignore. They notice messages are shorter, responses take longer, conversations become more practical and less emotional. The warmth that once defined the relationship begins fading. The most surprising part is that this shift is usually calm. An empath who has reached this stage often no longer feels the need to argue. Arguing requires emotional investment. Explaining requires emotional investment. Fighting for a relationship requires emotional investment. When they stop caring, they stop spending energy on battles they no longer believe can be won. Many people misinterpret this calmness as temporary frustration. They assume the empath will eventually return to the way they were before. They believe enough time will pass and everything will go back to normal. What they fail to understand is that the empath's emotional departure often happened long before their physical departure. By the time an empath reaches the silent exit, they have usually processed enormous amounts of disappointment internally. They have replayed conversations, examined patterns, questioned their own decisions, and given more chances than anyone realizes. The silence is not confusion, it is clarity. One reason the silent exit feels so powerful is because it removes something people often took for granted. The emotional support disappears. The understanding disappears. The willingness to overlook flaws disappears. The person who once invested endless energy into the relationship is no longer doing so. For those left behind, this can be difficult to accept. They may suddenly recognize how much the empath contributed. They may realize how many problems were quietly managed, how much encouragement was freely given, and how much emotional stability was provided. The absence becomes impossible to ignore because the value was only fully understood after it was gone.